All right. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome. I know you can't welcome me back because you're all muted. We'll explain a little bit why in just a minute. But this program that we have tonight is a very topical program, but also one that is very important to us as Jews. The state of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, is it's a foundational aspect of the identity of the Jewish people. In the Torah, the psalmist put it quite succinctly in Psalm 137, the very famous line, Im eshkachechi Yerushalayim tishkachi mini. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue stick to my palate. Im lo a'ale et Yerushalayim al rosh simchati. If I fail to recall you, if I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my foremost joy. We're going to hear tonight from Bard, who's an expert on the Middle East region, because we are right now, Israel is under attack. And the question comes up, I'm sure you have all thought about this, but it's come up a lot in my congregation, which is our brothers and sisters in Israel are putting their lives on the line. They're putting life and limb on the line to fight for the state of Israel. But what can we do in the diaspora? As a diaspora Jewish community, what can we do? And one of the things that we can do is to confront this phenomenon of misinformation that is being spread like wildfire throughout our society, throughout the media, throughout the streets, this false narrative that is coming across and seeping into the mainstream. And how do we fight misinformation? Well, with the greatest weapon we have, which is the truth, which are facts. And Dr. Mitchell Bard tonight is an expert on the Middle East, and he'll be providing us with some ammunition to fight back against this misinformation. And as I gave in my sermon last week, I said that long past are the times that we can just stand aside and say, I don't talk politics anymore. Because when we are confronted with misinformation, it is our duty, I believe, as Jews in the diaspora, to fight against the misinformation. And the way that we fight against it is with facts and with the truth. So Dr. Mitchell Bard will be providing us with these facts. He'll be discussing Israel's relations with its neighbors pre-October 7th and post-October 7th. After Dr. Bard's presentation, we'll open it up Q&A, a question and answer session, and more about that in just a minute. Because before I introduce our speaker tonight, I wanted to introduce myself for those of you I have yet to meet. My name is Rabbi David Lerner. I'm the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Sholom-Beth David in Rockville Centre, and I'll serve as moderator tonight. And with that, and accordingly, I want to say something about how our Q&A session will work this evening. So I will be asking all the questions tonight on behalf of all of you. So please stay muted throughout the program so we don't distract the speaker, don't raise any hands, don't send a message to the general chat. Please private message me. And you can do that by opening up your participant screen. You should see a button that says participants at the bottom, and open up that screen, and I should be near the top as a co-host. You just click on my name, and under more, you should see a chat, or double click on my name and send me your question. If you have a question anytime throughout Dr. Bard's presentation, please send it to me, and I will collate all the questions, and hopefully we'll have all of the questions answered at the end during our Q&A session. So again, please type to me in my chat, a private chat, with your question, and I'll collate them and ask them to Dr. Bard at the end. Also, before we start, I'd like to thank the CBSBD Sisterhood and our Never Again Committee for sponsoring this program, as well as Lisa Berman, who's also a co-host, for getting this off the ground, and Ira Salwin, of course, for planning, for the communication, and the tech support tonight. You see him there as the host. And our volunteer corps here at CBSBD is incredible, and I need to give just so much credit where credit is due. So thanks to all of you. And without further ado, our speaker this evening is Dr. Mitchell Bard, who is the executive director of the nonprofit American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise, AICE, and director of the Jewish Virtual Library. An authority on U.S. Middle East policy, Dr. Bard has appeared on international, national, and local TV and radio outlets. And his articles are published in major newspapers, magazines, and academic journals. He's the author of, get this, 22 books, and he still has time to talk with us tonight. He holds a PhD in political science from UCLA, a master's degree in public policy from Berkeley, and a BA in economics from UC Santa Barbara. And with that, I would like to relieve the mic and give it to Dr. Bard. Thank you for being here.
Thanks very much, Rabbi. Thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to speak. Not so used to doing it via remote, but we'll see how this goes. I appreciate all the people who made it possible and all of you who are joining in. I know you're all following the news pretty closely, and I'll try to give you some insights that maybe are not things you already know or see every day in the news. This is a subject that I'd be very intimately involved with under any circumstances, but I have a particular personal interest now since my son is a medic in the paratroopers and is in Gaza as we speak. You can start on October 7th to talk about what is going on in the Middle East, but I'd like to go back about 20 years to the Second Gulf War, which in many ways sowed the seeds for the situation we're in today. One of the things that was an outcome of the Gulf War was to wipe out the military of Iraq. And this at that time, or up until that time, had been the major counterweight to Iranian aggression. The Iranians were petrified of the Iraqis. That was their main concern and enemy. And once we vanquished Iraq, they no longer had anyone they saw as competition in the region, except Israel. The other outcome from the Gulf War was, or after the aftermath of the Gulf War, was the United States pulling its troops out of Iraq. Because up until that point, the Iranians were scared to death that the United States would make a right turn and go into Iran after Iraq to try to change the regime there as well. And once we removed our troops, they breathed a great sigh of relief. And over the last 20 some odd years, they've come to believe, and I think for good reason, which we can also talk about, that the United States isn't willing to confront them in any kind of serious way, other than having some sanctions, which for the most part have had limited impact on the Iranians. We haven't really done very much, and that's what I believe may be the most serious problem in the Middle East today, and it's being ignored to some degree, that while we're all looking at Gaza and we're looking at the various Iranian proxies, no one is paying enough attention to the Iranians themselves, who are continuing their steady march toward the building of a nuclear weapon. The latest report that just came out a few days ago from some scientists that said they're really only days away from having the capability to produce multiple nuclear weapons, at least in terms of the amount of enriched uranium that they would have to build them. To actually have a weapon will take them longer. There's a lot more complicated processes involved in translating the enriched uranium into an actual weapon that you can deliver, but they've already created the means to deliver a nuclear weapon with their advanced ballistic missiles, which we've seen on display in part in their attacks on Iraq in the last week, and in what the Houthis have been using that they've gotten from Iran. The other interesting thing that really just occurred to me today, and maybe it's occurred to other people, that the Iranians have really taken a page out of the Israeli playbook, that for many years, up until the Iranian Revolution, Israel had what was referred to as the periphery policy, which was the idea that the Arab states were their enemies for most of the period before the Iranian Revolution. And the Israelis wanted to build an alliance that basically surrounded their enemies. So they had alliances with the Iranians under the Shah and with the Turks in particular, who were on the periphery of the Arab states. And the hope was that by strengthening those relationships, it would help them in dealing with the Arab enemies that they had. Now the Iranians have basically done the same thing. The Turks no longer are great allies of Israel ever since President Erdogan Islamicized Turkey. They've been relatively hostile toward Israel. It's sort of waxed and waned, and right now they're in the waning period of being very hostile. They're also, by the way, in case you didn't know, a country that allows Hamas to not only live there, but also to plan operations there. But losing Turkey and Iran basically crumbled the Israeli periphery policy. The Iranians now have adopted it for themselves to try to surround Israel. So they have done what? They have armed and funded Hamas on one side of Israel. They have armed and funded Hezbollah in the north of Israel. They've been trying to infiltrate and create proxy forces in Syria on another Israeli border. And now you have them also supporting the Houthis, so that Israel is now fighting a battle with Iran, essentially on multiple fronts, with the Iranians sitting back happily letting the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Houthis all fight to the last of them, while the Iranian leaders sit comfortably in Tehran or in Qum and the other places where they live. The first place I would start with is probably the most surprising. That is Yemen. Who would have thought that when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, that Yemen would somehow get involved in the war? Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, and yet this tribe, the Houthis, have become a military force because of Iran providing them funds and weapons. And the Yemenis decided, probably not on their own, with Iranian instigation, no doubt, that they would get involved by starting to fire rockets toward Israel. And one of the interesting things about the response of Israel was it used the Arrow anti-missile system, which had never been used before, and for the first time was able to shoot down rockets in space, which no other ballistic missile system has ever done. The issue now is less with Israel, but with the rest of the world. Because as you can see from the map, and if you've been following the news, by firing these weapons at Yemen, or from Yemen, at shipping, they have basically scared off all the major shipping companies that normally would transit through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and on to other parts of the world. Now, those countries are having to take a much longer route, much more expensive route. It's costing the Egyptians billions of dollars in transit fees that they would normally get through the Suez Canal. And now, after several weeks of basically letting the Houthis carry on this way, we've finally seen the United States and the British take some measures to attack the Yemenis, the Yemenites, and to start to defend shipping. But so far, what they've done has been damaging very little of what the Houthis have. And so they're able to continue to threaten shipping. So until the United States, the UK, and any other countries that join the coalition, most of which are just coalition members in name, until they're able to stop the Houthis from firing rockets into the Red Sea, we're going to have a serious problem with our trade, and that will affect the prices of some of our goods, although it'll affect probably more the Europeans than it will us. So here you have a group that has nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with the Palestinians. There's no border dispute between Israel and Yemen. Yemen's never really been a factor in any of the prior Arab-Israeli wars. So this is all about Iran trying to open another front to distract Israel. Another place where the Iranians are active is in Iraq. Right now, the Iraqi militias that are linked to Iran haven't been particularly interested in Israel. They've been more interested in attacking American forces. And again, I think this is a major problem for the United States, that by failing to respond to those attacks from both Iraq and Syria, they've emboldened the Iranians to believe that they can get away with this. And also because the United States, when it has struck back, has only done it in Iraq or Syria and not directly at Iran. So it's again reinforcing the idea in the Iranians' minds that the United States just doesn't have the will to confront them directly. And I'm not sure if you know, but there have been something like 130 attacks by Iraqi and Syrian militias on American bases that have caused some injuries. I don't think any deaths to this point, but many injuries. And the United States has only responded to them on a handful of occasions. And by the way, this isn't just a Biden thing. This was Trump as well. That Trump at one point had threatened all kinds of consequences if the United States was attacked with ballistic missiles, and then it was attacked. And the Trump administration called off an attack that was scheduled at the last minute. So this is an ongoing problem, really, for the last 3 administrations. If we go on to Syria, in addition to what I just mentioned, the militias that are backed by Iran that have been attacking US forces, Iran has been trying to build a base of operations in Syria throughout the period of the Syrian civil war. They've been moving some of their guard troops into Syria. They've moved a lot of weapons. They've tried to establish a bulkhead from which they can attack Israel. And at the same time, many of their proxies from Lebanon, from Hezbollah, have also set up camp in Syria. They've at various times tried to get closer and closer to the Golan Heights to be right on the border to threaten Israel. And the Israelis, as you may know, have been launching airstrikes into Syria for years now, since the beginning also of the Syrian civil war. And it's become fairly routine for Israel to go in and bomb the Damascus airport, to bomb various warehouses, basically doing what they can to interdict any kind of transfer of weapons from Iran to Syria, trying to prevent those bases from being built, and to try to keep Hezbollah and the Iranians as far away from the border of Israel as possible. One of the other sort of interesting elements is the Russians, who have a base in Syria, and they are the main reason why the Syrians, why Bashar Assad was able to win the civil war, at least to the extent he won it. That is, he doesn't control all of Syria anymore, but he was only able to win what he has because of Russian support. And the Russians have been, in some ways, surprisingly docile when it comes to Israel, because Israel could not be launching these airstrikes in Syria without the Russians looking the other way. And so far, at least, that's continued even after October 7th, when the Russians have more or less sided with Hamas, less Hamas than just the Palestinians in general, who they've supported for decades anyway. If we move next to Lebanon, you know that the Iranians have the Hezbollah proxies there as basically the real government in Lebanon. It's become really a puppet of Iran over the years, with Hezbollah really holding the real control, and it's been very damaging to Lebanon. I'm not sure how many of you are old enough to remember when, Beirut used to be talked about as the Paris of the Middle East, and Lebanon was a very economically successful place. It was popular for tourists and Europeans especially, and it's been turned into a wasteland practically by Hezbollah, by their incompetence and their misrule, and by bringing the fight with Israel into Lebanon. And as you've seen since October 7th, Lebanon has been launching various attacks on northern Israel, and it forced Israel to evacuate all of the cities, towns, kibbutzim within about 2 miles of the border with Lebanon. Something like 80,000 Israelis had to leave their homes. They're now, in hotels or staying with relatives in other parts of Israel. And this is a situation that simply can't be sustained. Israel can't be in a position in the future where its citizens can't feel safe living along the border. It's been interesting to watch as the Lebanese have been very careful to not attack deeply into Israel in a way that would necessitate a major Israeli counterattack. They seem to be calibrating their violence to try to keep the Israeli army busy without bringing on the full force of the IDF. You may have heard that the Minister of Defense said that if there is no diplomatic solution in the next couple of weeks, that Israel is going to have to take more concerted action. There's a UN resolution. Again, if you know the history, when Israel had fought Hezbollah the last time, the United States basically forced Israel to end the war and said, we're going to create this UN peacekeeping force that's going to prevent any smuggling into Lebanon. They're going to lead to the disarmament of Hezbollah, and they're going to require Hezbollah to be north of the Litani River, some distance from the Israeli border. Well, as it turned out, this UN peacekeeping force has been completely useless. It hasn't stopped any of the smuggling. It hasn't stopped Hezbollah from building bases right up to the border of Israel, and certainly didn't do anything to disarm them. So right now, there are these negotiations going on where they're basically trying to get Hezbollah to agree to comply with this UN resolution, and there's absolutely zero chance of that happening. So what I fear is most likely is we're going to have a major war with Lebanon, and it's just a question of when. Lebanon, just like in Gaza, the Hezbollah has dug tunnels all over Lebanon for moving troops. They had plans to do the same thing that the Hamas did on October 7th. You may remember a couple of years ago, Israel discovered tunnels that were leading into Israel, and they destroyed them. At least we think they've destroyed them all. But the plan for many years of Hezbollah was to do exactly what Hamas did, that is to sneak into northern Israel, to try to infiltrate kibbutzim, to try to establish a position to fight the Israelis from Israeli territory and to take hostages, to do exactly what Hamas has done. The bigger problem at the moment is that Hezbollah has something like 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel. And unlike the rockets that Hamas has, most of which really are not very accurate, Hezbollah has gotten from Iran very sophisticated rockets, which can reach most of Israel. And once a war starts, it's entirely likely that Hezbollah will fire not just a few thousand rockets, but tens of thousands of rockets at Haifa, at Tel Aviv, at Jerusalem, at all major population centers, not just the small towns in the north. So Israel is going to have to be able to knock out those rockets almost immediately. And I saw a story today saying that Israel believes that it can do that. I hope so. But one of the other issues has to do with the air defenses with Iron Dome. You've all followed how successful the Iron Dome has been in shooting down Hamas rockets. Well, one of the things that Hamas was testing early on was whether the Iron Dome could handle hundreds or thousands of rockets at one time. And the fear is, and the likelihood, that if Hezbollah was to launch thousands of rockets at one time, that it would overwhelm the Iron Dome system and many of those rockets would get through. So this is, I think, the thing that I'm most scared of at the moment, because I think it's inevitable that Israel has to have this fight. Right now, the United States is doing everything to try to prevent it. There were stories that there was a plan for Israel to have a preemptive attack on Hezbollah almost immediately after October 7th, and that the United States talked them out of it. Biden has already told Netanyahu, basically, if you start the war, you're on your own. So part of the calculation in Israel is that they want to be able to show that Hezbollah has done something that is so threatening that they have no choice but to go to war. Another front that's being largely ignored, I think, by the media is in Judea, Samaria, and the West Bank. If you read a lot of the Israeli press, you know that Israel has been conducting military operations every single day in various parts of the West Bank. And what's interesting about it, or one interesting aspect, is the Biden administration is talking about how the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank should take over Gaza at the end of this war, as if the Palestinian Authority is some sort of Monaco of the Middle East, that it's this peaceful place. Every day, there are terrorists trying to infiltrate Israel from the West Bank. And these fights that are going on, who are they fighting? There are hundreds, thousands of terrorists in various parts of the West Bank that are heavily armed. There was a story that one of the things that the IDF was doing in part of the West Bank is removing IEDs, which are extremely dangerous to Israeli forces. So they've got all kinds of weapons in the West Bank. They've got hundreds, probably thousands of terrorists. And these are people who are continuing to threaten Israel even while the fight's going on in Gaza. So that's why the IDF is operating. And maybe it's a good thing that the press isn't paying any attention, because a lot of Palestinians are also being killed in those operations. Some civilians who are often in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sometimes it's just that firefights have collateral damage, and it's very unfortunate and tragic. You may have heard that there was a Palestinian American who was killed the other day. It's not clear exactly the circumstances, but you can be sure Israel's immediately blamed. That brings us to Gaza. I'm not sure how much I need to tell you, since there's plenty in the media every single day. You know that Hamas uses its people, the Palestinian people, as human shields, which has been the major reason for so many of the civilian casualties. We're seeing how the terrorists were able to build a tunnel network that's more widespread, larger than the subway system in London. It's much bigger than the entire Gaza Strip and its twists and turns throughout. You've seen the videos, no doubt, of Israeli soldiers going into houses and finding under children's beds tunnel entrances. They're in everything. They have tunnels and they have arsenals in schools, in mosques, in residential homes, in hospitals. And so all of those, by the way, according to the laws of war, once they have weapons that are threatening, that makes them legitimate military targets. And it's very difficult for Israel, obviously, to have to fight in hospitals or in mosques where they're sure to be getting bad publicity. But this is part of the strategy of Hamas all along, is that their goal is to have as many Palestinians die as possible because it makes Israel look that much worse. Palestinians don't have to be dying in Gaza. For one thing, if Hamas had not spent tens of millions of dollars building this tunnel system, they could have been building shelters for civilians. Also, I blame the Biden administration for not letting Gazans out of Gaza. There's no reason why hundreds of thousands of Gazans need to be stuck in a confined space out of harm's way as much as possible, when they could simply cross the border and go into the Sinai, and then they could get all the humanitarian aid anybody wants. They could set up refugee camps there. They could bring in all sorts of food and supplies and medical equipment, and Israel wouldn't have to inspect it, and we wouldn't have this humanitarian crisis. But by forcing the Gazans to stay there, we've created a crisis or made it much worse. And it's not just the United States, it's also Egypt, which doesn't want any Palestinians on its territory. The Hamas, remember, is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the principal enemy of the Egyptians. So the last thing they want is any Palestinian presence in their territory where they can create chaos for the Egyptian government. But this is creating a terrible situation, and many civilians are suffering. There's no question about it. One of the other aspects of it is the fact that all of the information that is being broadcast is almost exclusively coming from Hamas sources. That is, any journalist who is operating in Gaza can only report what Hamas wants it to. Otherwise, they'd be either expelled or tortured or killed. And so if you look at who's actually reporting, you don't see any of the major correspondents in Gaza itself. They're getting their information from all sorts of Arab stringers and representatives of various Arab publications, some of which are associated with Hamas and Hezbollah and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You may have seen a story, for example, about how many journalists have been killed, and Israel's being blamed for killing something like 79 journalists. Well, I and other people have gone through the list and basically found that most of them aren't journalists. They're often journalists working for Hamas. or Hezbollah, that most of them who were killed weren't killed because they were reporting a story and Israel targeted them. Most of them died in buildings that were blown up because terrorists were based there. And one of the recent cases where two journalists were killed in an airstrike on a car, they were with a Hamas terrorist who was operating a drone from the car. So this isn't being told by the media. The other thing is we have this really kind of sick sporting event that's been created by the press of keeping track of the number of casualties as though it was a sporting event. And because Israel hasn't had as many deaths as Palestinians, then Palestinians win. And the basic assumption is that Israel should be letting more of its citizens die so that the scoreboard would be more even. And if it's not, that must mean that Israel is acting with disproportionate force. The other aspect of that is that all of the information about casualties comes from the health ministry run by Hamas. And when they say 25,000 civilians have been killed, they don't count any terrorists. So Israel says it's killed 9,000 terrorists so far, and there are hundreds of thousands more who've been arrested or injured. Those nobody talks about. When the New York Times reports how many deaths there are, they just say 25,000 civilians. They don't say it's 9,000 terrorists. They also don't consider how many Palestinians may be killed by rockets fired by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad that land on Palestinians in Gaza. We had a case early in the war, you probably remember, where a big story that Israel bombed a hospital and 400 people, innocent people, were killed. Went all around the world within minutes. It caused riots throughout the Middle East. It was one of the major reasons that the protests around the world and on college campuses really escalated after this one particular story. And as many of you probably know, it turned out that it took a while for Israel to get all the facts out. But when it did, it was clear that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad had fired a rocket that landed in a parking lot. It didn't actually hit the hospital either. It landed in a parking lot, and it didn't kill 500. It killed maybe 100 to 300, but it wasn't Israel that did it. And so here, 300 civilians, say, who were on that list of 25,000 who weren't killed by Israel, they were killed by their own people. So you're getting a lot of misleading information. This isn't to downplay the fact that there are many innocent civilians who are dying in the crossfire. And this is tragic and it's unfortunate, but not a single Palestinian would be injured had Hamas not attacked on October 7th. The other issue, of course, is the hostages. And I don't know if you all are aware that we talk about there being 136 hostages at the moment. I think it's 136 now. I was just hearing this afternoon, 28 of those are dead, that Israel has confirmed. So we're really talking about something like 106, 108 hostages who are still alive. The conditions are horrific. There was an incredible interview today, if you get I-24 News, with an elderly woman who was a hostage, who told an incredible story in great detail about what she went through and the conditions that the hostages were in. And it's really hard to believe that even the 106 or 8 could survive in those conditions for now more than 3 months. It's really one of the most horrific aspects of this entire experience. And as somebody who studies the Holocaust, I'm always amazed by how there's always another story that I don't know of some horror that took place. And the same thing is happening with the war in Gaza, that every day you hear some more horrific story from a hostage who survived or from soldiers. And it's something that, as you know, Israelis are really crushed over. You see this particular picture I took when I was in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv. But I don't envy the prime minister in this case, because it is in an impossible position. What do you do if Israel surrenders to Hamas in order to get the hostages back? There'll be another 10-7 at some point, as the Hamas has promised. If Israel makes some sort of deal and gives up thousands of hostages, or I'm sorry, prisoners in Israeli jails, that's going to create more incentives for Palestinians and other terrorists to take more Israelis hostage in the future. And as you may know, the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, was one of the prisoners that was released in the exchange to get Gilad Shalit back. Hamas even holds bodies hostage. We're all focused on the people who were taken on October 7th, but there are 2 Israelis who have been hostage. Their bodies have been hostage now for years and haven't been released. So for Israel to make a deal and not get everybody back, it's going to be, I think, a disaster. But you can't blame any family member for saying, do anything you can to get our people back. I think it's going to be very difficult. You hear there are negotiations going on now. There are all sorts of offers. I wouldn't believe anything you hear until there's actually a formal announcement of an agreement and you see hostages coming out. But it's really unimaginable what might be going on, especially to women. And you've probably heard some of the horrific stories we already know about the sexual abuse of women and the silence of the women's organizations around the world not to care when it comes to abuse of Jewish women or Israeli women has been another of the most appalling aspects of this. Let me just talk about U.S. policy for a second. In many ways, Joe Biden has been the most supportive president in American history during wartime. No American president ever visited Israel during a war. Most of the time, we stood at arm's length. In 1948 and 1967, the U.S. had an arms embargo to prevent weapons from going to Israel. Instead, President Biden has this bill to provide more than $14 billion worth of aid to Israel, which is being hung up, unfortunately, in Congress over issues that have nothing to do with Israel. But even with that being held up, the Biden administration has delivered a lot of weaponry and munitions that Israel desperately needs. Firing all of those interceptors from Iron Dome, Israel doesn't have an infinite supply. It needs to get more. And so it's very crucial that Israel continue to get supplies from the United States. That does give the United States some leverage over Israel, and it's using it. The Biden administration is having a hard time, turning on the TV and seeing civilian casualties. This was one of the things that led Ronald Reagan to stop the Lebanon war back in '82, seeing the civilian casualties. To some degree, the Biden administration seems to be trying to micromanage the war and telling Israel how to fight it, which some of you may find disturbing. The administration also is doing some positive things in terms of diplomacy. It's helping with the hostage negotiations, partly for our own reasons, because we have at least 8 hostages among the group, but also at the United Nations. It's only the US veto that's preventing the United Nations from imposing sanctions, calling for a ceasefire, taking some other draconian action against Israel. That could change if the Israelis do things against the advice of the administration. At any point, the president can decide we're not going to shield you at the UN anymore, or we're not going to continue to provide the weapons we are. And Israel's done a number of things to aggravate the administration, one being the number of civilian casualties, another just today, there are families and Israelis who are blocking the entrance of humanitarian aid through the Israeli gate to Gaza, because they say, why should Gazans be getting any sort of aid when our hostages are not getting released? And that upset the administration. They're upset about what they see as settler violence against Palestinians, although they've vastly exaggerated how much is going on. They don't like the announcements Israel has just made in the last few days about setting up a security zone just on the other side of the border in Gaza, which is something that's going to be absolutely necessary for Israeli security. How can Israel turn Gaza back to the way it was before October 7th and let Palestinians come right up to the border with Israel, where they're within easy rocket range of attacking the kibbutzim and the towns they attacked on October 7th? But that's going to be a cause of continuing tension. You know that the Biden administration also wants a 2-state solution and wants the Israelis to commit now to establishing a Palestinian state. And there's no way that Israel's going to do that. Israel has offered the Palestinians a state on multiple occasions, and the Palestinians have rejected it. And there's no reason to expect the Palestinians to accept one in the future. But it's really pie in the sky. There's really zero chance of a 2-state solution, probably in our lifetime. And I could go into the details of why that is. But I want to finish up so you have time for questions, and just say one last thing about the US policy. We're in an election season, and that's going to probably have some impact on how President Biden pursues policy in the next 10 months or so, because he has to worry about how all of this going on in the Middle East is going to affect his reelection. You know that there are a lot of Arab Americans who are very upset with his support for Israel, and they have a whole vote against Biden movement in Michigan and in some other places. And given the likelihood that this is going to be a close election, Biden can ill afford losing many votes. The good news is there are a lot more pro-Israel voters out there than anti-Israel voters, and he has to also pay attention to them as well. But who knows what's going to happen by November of 2024. We don't know who will be the president. We don't know what's going to be happening in the Middle East. Israel has said it expects the war with Hamas to go on for months, if not years. So we could be still seeing fighting going on in Gaza. We could see fighting in Lebanon. And we could have a new president with an entirely different policy. We won't know. So there's a lot of unknowns, and none of them can make us feel very comfortable. And certainly, from my perspective, as someone, as a parent who has to worry about their son in Gaza every night, I can sympathize in a way that maybe I never could before with the situation every Israeli family is facing today. Let me stop there, and we can take questions. We could talk about the campus. We could talk about other things if you like, besides what I've been talking about. And you can look up Myths and Facts on the Jewish Virtual Library. You can sign up for our weekly email. We have a whole collection of myths and facts just about the Gaza war. And those are very important to help you understand what's going on and to be able to refute a lot of the misinformation that's out there. Questions, comments, alternative speeches?
Well, thank you, Dr. Bard, for really illuminating and informative talk. Really appreciate it. I have some questions. First, you started out talking about Iran, and it seems that the root of this conflict is Iran, but not just this conflict, but there's a lot of Iran supports a lot of terrorism across the world, threatens the world economy with its proxies. What is at the core of the reluctance by the West to confront Iran? And what, in your opinion, is good policy, not just for Israel regarding Iran, but for the West, the US in particular?
Well, I have a column in the Jewish News Service this week about this, where I argue that basically Iran has humiliated Biden and the United States because of our unwillingness to act. The administration made a big show of sending 2 aircraft carrier task force to the region. And I had high hopes that now we had the power on station to take care of the Iranian nuclear problem, to destroy their nuclear capabilities and not have to go on the ground at all. It can all be done through the air and through rockets and missiles. But those aircraft carriers might as well be garbage scows for all the good they're doing. The idea was they were going to deter attacks on Israel, but it didn't deter the Hezbollah at all. They're attacking every day. Maybe they think it deterred Iran from attacking directly, but it's unlikely Iran was going to do that anyway. The person who asked the question is right. It's not just about Israel. This is a threat to the entire world. The Islamist regime believes that the whole world should be Islamic. For them, Israel's just a speed bump on the way to Europe to finish what the Muslim empire failed to do hundreds of years ago. So they want to destroy the West. And if the West doesn't react, we're going to have much more serious problems, because once Iran has a nuclear weapon, nothing can stop them, because then we will certainly be afraid to ever attack them out of fear they will use a nuclear weapon, and there's no reason to believe they won't. In fact, they've said that they would. So my belief, and I know, I'm not in a majority by any means, is I've believed for a long time the only way to deal with the Iranian problem is militarily. We have to destroy their nuclear capabilities. We have to do what we can to change the regime there. The reason for the reluctance is, we don't want another war. American people don't want to get into another war. And it won't be necessarily an easy one. Most people think, it's going to involve ground troops. It'll be like the war with Iraq. But again, it doesn't have to. It can be done in a variety of different ways. We could take out their oil terminals and their ports where they get all of their commercial goods and cripple them that way, for example. Sanctions haven't worked at all. They've been a complete, not disaster, but they simply haven't stopped Iran from marching toward a nuclear weapon. And if you want to see or learn more about how a military campaign could be run, go to the Jewish Virtual Library, and I have a article about the military options.
Okay, and sticking with the U.S., we're in an election season, and you said some very good and supportive things about the Biden administration up to a point. In your opinion, who do you think would be better for Israel, Biden or Trump?
I feel very strongly both ways. Look, I wrote an article a few weeks ago that every president in American history has done positive and negative things. There are people who say Donald Trump was the most pro-Israel president in history. Well, I can, agree with a lot of the things that he did, like moving the embassy and recognizing the Golan Heights, but I could also name for you many things that he did that were very harmful to Israel. Same goes for Biden. While he's been very supportive of Israel during the war, he's also been supportive of the Palestinians and giving them hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, which helps to subsidize their pay-to-slave program. That is, the Palestinian Authority, who Biden wants to put in charge of Gaza, pays salaries to people who tried to kill Jews who are in Israeli jails, or who were suicide bombers who died, and now their families get stipends. And now all of these terrorists who Israel captured and are putting in jail, they're all going to get tens of thousands of dollars from the Palestinian Authority for the good work they did in slaughtering Jews. And this is who the Biden administration has been giving money to. They also gave money after Trump had cut it off to the UN Refugee and Welfare Agency, UNRWA, which we're seeing, and most of us knew before, was used as a base to hide tunnels. Its teachers have been teaching anti-Semitism for years. There was just a story today about how many of the UNRWA employees were involved with Hamas. So, I could do this for every president, or Ronald Reagan, who was one of the most pro-Israel, or Dwight Eisenhower, who's often considered one of the least. Every president has their issues with Israel because we have our own interests. So and it's hard to know what Trump will do, or even Biden will do in a second term. Remember, once they don't have to worry about being reelected, they don't necessarily have to pursue the same policies. Trump doesn't have to worry about the evangelical vote that affected his policies toward Israel and when he was president. Biden won't have to worry about the Jewish vote. So policy could change dramatically in a second term.
Well, thank you. I have a feeling the questioner wanted a Biden or Trump clear answer, but
how about Haley?
or Haley, right? Okay, so this one, you talked about the financial support coming from the U.S. We have a question from Alexis, who asks, what proportion of the Israeli budget goes to defense, and how much has been used since October 7th? And what happens when Israel goes over budget or this war drags on? We talk about, the military costs with human life. What about the economic costs, and how long can Israel survive a prolonged war?
Well, this is one of the critical aspects of the war that gets neglected outside of Israel mostly. I think that Israel has something like 5% of its budget now goes to defense. I read somewhere it's something like the 10th highest in the world. It used to be much higher, though. And how much has been spent now, and what happens if there's a deficit? I don't know how much has been spent. I know that Israel will spend whatever it needs to. It just is passing a new budget where it's going to be diverting a lot of its resources from other governmental activities to the war. There's a lot of political back and forth about the budget because some members of the coalition want money to go toward the religious parties or religious schools. Some members of the coalition want money to go to the settlements, and other members of the coalition, who I think are the majority, think all or most of the money that's discretionary needs to go for the war effort. I think that it's costing Israel something like $600 million a week, or is it a month? I forget now, but it's costing huge amounts of money, and there's nobody working. I mean, imagine, if most of the American workforce suddenly had to go to war, and nobody was working in high tech, and nobody was, delivering your mail, and nobody was waiting your table at the restaurant. I mean, to have 300,000 reservists, my son is also a reservist, out of their normal jobs is a tremendous burden on the entire society. And there is a limit to how long it can go on. Israel is recognizing that, and that's why you're seeing and hearing that some of the units are being rotated out. Some are going to just do more training. Some are going to be allowed to go back to work. Supposedly, my son's is one that's going to be released, hopefully at the end of the month. So that will help a little. But remember also that one of the major components of the Israeli economy is tourism, which is now zero. Just now, in the last couple of weeks, more airlines have agreed to fly. I don't think any American airline is flying to Israel. The only way to get there is on El Al. So no one's going anyway. So that's causing tremendous loss to the country. And this is going to drain the coffers over the course of the war. But, that I think is in some ways the least of Israel's worries. It will survive economically, even if this war does go on, as it has in the past.
Okay, so one more question about the conflict, and then there are a couple about solutions. You mentioned disproportionality. And the disproportionality has been framed as just deaths in general on both sides. So the question is, there's another perhaps aspect of disproportionality, which is the ratio of civilian to combatants deaths. What do you know? Do we know what is the ratio in this war of civilian to combatant death? And what is normal for urban warfare? And is Israel, as I know, Colonel, I think Kemp comes out and talks about all the time about how Israel is, compared to the rest of the world, Israel is high and above every country in the world when it comes to minimizing civilian deaths. Why is that, not talked about? And is this another case where Israel is high above the rest of the world and what it would be when it comes to urban warfare?
Well, again, I'd refer you to my Jewish Virtual Library for some articles from more legal scholars than me about the laws of war and disproportionality. But basically, there's no fixed ratio of how many civilians can die before it becomes disproportional. It has to do with the merits or the reasons for the target. And if civilians die in the course of being in a place that is a legitimate target, that's just the cost of war. And when they are in, hospitals or installations that are normally civilian that have been turned into military targets by Hamas placing itself there, then those are not, it's not disproportionate for those people to be killed. This is another thing that drives me crazy with the media. They talk about what's going on around or in the hospitals, and they talk as if there are no terrorists there. They say there's a firefight going on at the hospital as if Israel's just shooting at itself. But there are terrorists in the hospitals, they're around the hospitals, they've known it for years. The famous Shifa hospital that got so much attention early in the war, they've known for years. There's an NPR documentary all about the terrorists in Shifa hospital. So there's just a lot of misinformation about that. In terms of the ratio, well, we don't know, because we don't know how many of the 25,000 Hamas claims died are really 25,000, and how many of them are combatants. If it's 9,000 terrorists and the other 15,000 are civilians, you can figure out the ratio. In the past, what we've learned is that Hamas even admits that many of the people who were called civilians turn out to be terrorists. I forgot now the other part of the question. What was the other part of the question? Sorry.
In comparison to the rest of
Comparisons. Well, I've seen some
Russian,
comparisons. Yeah, I've seen some comparisons that have been suggesting Israel has killed many more civilians in much less time, but it's an entirely different situation. First of all, there's no war that I know of that's been fought with the enemy in tunnels underneath the entire civilian population. To be able to go after terrorists who are in tunnels underneath civilian buildings, that's never been done before. We fought to some, there have been some tunnels in Vietnam and in some other places, but nothing on this scale. And there's a lot of hypocrisy. Think about World War II and the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, and not to mention the dropping in the atomic bombs. And when did we open a humanitarian corridor to provide aid to the Germans during World War II? Carpet bombing of Cambodia. You can go through what we did in the Iraq War and the number of civilians who were killed. Just under Barack Obama launched more drone attacks supposed to kill terrorists that ended up killing hundreds of civilians. You don't hear about that. So it's terrible that these civilians are dying. And when you see the pictures, they're heartbreaking, and it is extremely damaging to Israel's image, and it fuels the political opposition to Israel. But also, what Colonel Kemp points out all the time is Israel does something else that no other army does. We warn civilians. Who does that? I mean, the United States never went and said, hey, Saddam, move your soldiers out of the way because we're coming, and take your families with you. But Israel drops millions of flyers. They make phone calls. I had lunch with a friend in Israel when I was there who said he was one of the guys, he speaks Arabic. So he said he was one of the guys who was calling people, talking to them personally on the phone, telling them you should leave, and move to a safer place. So no other army does that. But Israel's going to get, blamed. It's going to get pilloried no matter what because of the sheer numbers and the pictures.
Well, going along with that, as a follow-up to that, Steve asks why there's not as much of an outcry about Russia deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine as there is when Israel is actually trying to avoid civilian casualties. Why is there this double standard? I guess probably one of the most frustrating aspects.
Anti-Semitism, bias, Jews are news. I mean, it's incredibly frustrating that there is a double standard. And when we deal with, publicity or public relations related to Israel, we can't just complain that the media is biased. We have to start from the fact that they're biased, and then how do we operate given that bias? You're not going to change it. You can have all of these media monitoring organizations that you want. They don't affect how the media covers anything. They might get them to correct something after the fact that nobody ever reads, but they don't prevent the bias to begin with. And yeah, it's a perfect example. The New York Times is publishing these satellite photos in the paper all the time, showing Israeli troop movement. Where are the Israeli troops? Where are the buildings that have been bombed? Have they run? Maybe I missed it. I don't live in New York. You guys do. Has the New York Times had satellite photos showing the movements of the Russians in Ukraine or the Ukrainian movements? Have they shown satellite photos of all of the damage that's been done by Russian bombing? It's maddening, but it's the reality that Jews and the news about Jews is treated completely differently. There's no question about it. There have been horrific wars fought in other places and not gotten nearly the attention that this war is getting. Think about all the terrorists in Nigeria who kill school girls. Nobody pays any attention to that. Think about the Syrian civil war. How much do you know about the Syrian civil war? The number of Palestinians who were killed, tortured, arrested, forced to be refugees again in Syria. Nobody talks about it, especially not the people who say they're supportive of the Palestinians, who care about Palestinian welfare and justice. They never talk about how Palestinians are treated in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Syria, where they're all second-class citizens, persecuted, arrested, tortured. So, and one of the other interesting things, Hamas has fired something like 14,000 rockets. Other than through the IDF, have you seen a single picture of a Hamas terrorist firing a rocket on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, ABC, any network? Have you seen a picture of a terrorist? Not one. They're like ghosts. This happened in the war in Lebanon. A journalist named Marvin Kalb wrote an article about how the Hezbollah terrorists were like ghosts in Lebanon because there were no pictures of Hezbollah ever shooting a rocket at Israel. And it's the same thing now. How could it be that there are 14,000 or 30,000 Hamasniks and you haven't seen a picture of one of them? You hear about these hospital shootouts. Have they showed you a picture of the Hamas people shooting anybody? It's just astounding, except if you recognize that no one is allowed to report from Gaza anything that Hamas doesn't want them to say or see. And a lot of what you do see is staged, where you'll see famous pictures of a building that Israel destroyed, and in the middle of all of this destruction, there'll be this perfectly pristine teddy bear that was somehow not touched by the destruction because it was placed there for the effect. So again, there's very little we can do about this except try to point it out. But the major media, and this includes even the Wall Street Journal's news page these days, just give us a completely distorted picture of what's going on. One of the other distortions that I was having a conversation about this today is about the success Israel's having. If you listen to the Western media, you'd think that Israel was losing the war, but Israel's had tremendous progress in a very short amount of time in this war. But I would say, on the other side, from Israel's perspective, Israel lost on October 7th. Israel will never be the same. People are going to be traumatized for a generation, not just the people who were directly affected, but the entire country. And in that respect, Hamas won. They were able to make Israelis afraid. And Hezbollah is trying to do the same thing. And that's why it's so important and crucial that Israel ignore whatever advice and pressure they're getting from outside and make sure that they destroy Hamas and hopefully Hezbollah as well.
And going along with the question of trauma, someone with the username Maislin asks, in your opinion, do you think that the remaining hostages can be saved?
I certainly would like to say so. I think it's disappointing, obviously, that the IDF hasn't been able to find them. They discovered this tunnel the other day where the hostages had been held but had been moved. In fact, this woman that I mentioned earlier who gave the interview today, they were showing the video from that tunnel with the cages, and she was saying how she was there and that she saw two of the men who had been taken, who were in those cages. So, as I mentioned, we apparently some 28 are dead already. How many could survive in those conditions with little food, no light, little or no water, no exercise, no medication? Supposedly, they were supposed to get medication. We have no way of knowing if they got any. The Red Cross has done nothing, which is a repeat of what they did in the Holocaust. So, there were people with very serious injuries. The president of my organization's great nephew, Hirsch Goldberg. So that his name? I'm blanking on his name, but you've seen his parents. He was. We saw the video. He had part of his arm blown off. What kind of condition could he be in after 3 months? Did he get any medical treatment? I saw a video today of one of the women who was released, who said that she had an operation and they put her leg on backwards, or in the misdirection. So what could be going on with the women there is too horrifying to even think about. What's Hamas? What's their game? What's in it for them? They know Israel's going to try to kill them all. So why would they give up these hostages? They're supposedly Sinwar and some of the other high-ranking officials have probably surrounded themselves with hostages to make sure that they won't get attacked. Supposedly Israel knows where they are, but won't attack because of that. I hate to be a doomsayer, but I'm very afraid that very few are going to come back alive. But I just watched a movie last night about a group of Uruguayan rugby players, I think, whose plane crashed in the middle of the Andes, and a group of them somehow survived after I forget how many months in the middle of freezing cold in the Andes. So, the human spirit is something incredible. And we saw it from some of the people who've been released. And I'm hopeful that the rest have found a way to keep their spirits up and to survive.
Yeah, with all the atrocious acts that have been perpetrated, Melissa asks, how can Israel even negotiate with these entities anymore? You mentioned how the U.S. administration is now pushing for a two-state solution. How is that even potentially feasible? How is all of these dreams of peace, are they now destroyed? Are they shattered?
Well, I believe they were shattered in 2005 when Israel withdrew every soldier and civilian from Gaza. And the Palestinians could have built a state there. Maybe Israel wouldn't have let them call it a state, but they could have built the infrastructure. And if they had kept the peace and didn't bother Israel and just said, hey, we hate Israel, but we'll leave them alone and build our state, we could be talking about peace now. But the whole idea of land for peace was blown up by Hamas, because as soon as Israel gave up the territory, they didn't get peace. They got thousands and thousands of rockets, and now they got October 7th. So the idea that Israel can make concessions to the Palestinians while the ones in the West Bank are trying to kill Jews and the ones in Gaza already killed Jews, it's a little bit phantasmagorical, if you could say that. I talk about the two-state solution as the State Department's unicorn. There's zero chance of a two-state solution as far as I can see. You haven't heard them talk about how that would happen. For example, what's going to happen to the Jews, the 500,000 Jews who live in Judea and Samaria? Are they going to is the United States going to wave a magic wand and they're going to disappear? Are they going to expect Israel to force 100,000, which is what it would take, force 100,000 Jews to pack up their belongings and leave their homes so that they can make way for a Palestinian state? And Israelis pay attention to what the Palestinians say in Arabic. And when they say that they're going to do October 7th again, and when they say that they're going to destroy Israel in stages, and yeah, if you give us a state from the 67 borders, we'll take it. But that's only the first step towards liberating all of Palestine. You know, this you hear the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And you had these three genius presidents from the university saying that that wasn't threatening genocide for the Jewish people. Well, read what the Arabs say, what they mean. They don't mince words about what from the river to the sea actually means. Just look at a map. Any map in the Palestinian textbook or the Palestinian Authority, there is no map that shows a state of Israel. And the maps they have put the names of Arab cities where Israeli cities now are. So the notion that you're going to have two states with this generation of Palestinians, I think, is just pure folly. Maybe a new generation will be raised someday, but you know, there was always a hope for that. There would be a new generation after Arafat. But what's happened is, look at the schools. What do they teach in Palestinian schools, in the UNRWA schools? They teach them not about peace. They teach them about holy wars. They teach them about to be anti-Semitic, to hate Israel, hate Jews. This is the, you know, look at the films of the summer camps in Gaza. You know, all these, it's terrible, all the children who are being killed in this conflict. Those children were going to be terrorists when they grew up because they went to these summer camps where they were taught how to kidnap Israelis. They were taught how to slit Israelis' throats. You can sign up. I have a weekly email. A couple of weeks ago, I had a video. You can find it on YouTube of a kindergarten where they were acting out this whole series of attacks on Israel. And in summer camps, they do this. So the hope that another generation of Palestinians will be different has really been killed by the education system. And again, it's something the United States and others have supported in terms of continuing to give money for them.
So I have a lot of questions that can all kind of be put into one category. So I'll put it into two final questions. I'll start with the easy one. How is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolved?
It isn't going to be resolved. Just as and it's not because it's not about land. This is the misperception. You hear always this phrase, it's a fight between two peoples over the same land. It's not about land. That's one characteristic, but it's mostly at root religious. You know, starting from the days of the Mufti in the 1920s, who said that this was an Islamic war. He opposed the presence of Jews because they were Jews. This is what Hamas says. The Hamas charter says explicitly they're going to kill all the Jews and that there's no place for a Jewish state in the Islamic heartland. And there's a lot of fantasies about the Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority being secular. Look at the constitution that they wrote for the Palestinian state. It says that Islam is going to be the national religion, just like every other Arab state. So the idea that you can solve this without a change in Islam makes it very difficult to imagine. But it's not, it's not impossible. Let me give you the positive spin, which is in 1947, one of the Jewish leaders was talking to one of the British officials, and the British official said, you're never going to get a Jewish state, because the only way that there's ever going to be a Jewish state is if the United Nations votes for partition, and that can only happen if Russia and the United States agree. And the Soviets will never agree with the United States. It will never happen. It can't possibly happen. Well, partition resolution, the Soviets voted for it, and partition passed. For 30 years, people doing Hasbara said, no Arab will ever make peace. It can't possibly happen. They want to drive the Jews into the sea. And then 1977, Sadat goes to Jerusalem. He convinces the people of Israel that he's sincere. You get peace with an Arab Muslim leader. It took 15 more years, but King Hussein made peace, another Arab Muslim leader. And then you had, years later, the Abraham Accords. Who thought any of the Gulf states would make peace? Because they always said there has to be a Palestinian state before we'll make peace. But Bahrain and the UAE did it, and they've kept the peace, even during this war with Hamas. They didn't abandon Israel. And now you have this nonsense from the State Department where Blinken said he went to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis say, we won't make peace with Israel unless they give the Palestinians a state. This is the same thing John Kerry said right before the Abraham Accords, that he talked to all the Arabs and none of them would ever make peace with Israel unless there was a Palestinian state. And then you had the Abraham Accords. The Saudis could care less about the Palestinians. They hate the Palestinians. They look down on the Palestinians. And what the Saudis care about is two things: keeping their royal heads, well, actually one thing, keeping their royal heads on their royal shoulders. And the way they're going to do that is by getting a security commitment from the United States, by getting continued flow of weapons, and they hope a help in developing nuclear, a civilian, they say, nuclear capability. That's what they want. If the United States gives them that, they will make peace with Israel in a minute and abandon the Palestinians, just like the UAE did, just like Bahrain did, just like King Hussein did, just like Anwar Sadat did. So that's the more hopeful version.
So working for the outside, peace with Arab countries on the outside. So sort of what the Trump approach that brought the Abraham Accords, and I guess Jared Kushner did a lot of the liaisoning. So you're saying it would come from the outside Arab countries, not directly with Palestinians, because we got a question from Melissa that said, how can you negotiate with someone who won't even recognize your right to exist?
Well, on one hand, that's true. That's why Israel wouldn't negotiate with Hamas. But Israel's been negotiating with the Palestinians for decades. Let's not forget how many times the Palestinians had a chance for a state. First in 1937, when the Peel Plan was announced, the partition of Palestine that would have given the Arabs most of the territory. In 1939, the British wanted to create a Arab state that was going to be a majority of Palestinians and place restrictions on Jewish immigration. Then you had partition in 1947, which was going to create a Palestinian state. They went to war instead. Then for 19 years, from 1949 to 1967, you never heard about a Palestinian state. Nobody ever talks about this. How is it that for 19 years, those Palestinians who desperately want and deserve a state never mentioned it? Nobody said from the river to the sea, we must be free, get the Egyptians out, get the Jordanians out. Why aren't they saying from the river to beyond from the sea to beyond the river to all of Jordan, which was Palestine? So they were offered a state. Well, they were offered autonomy by Begin in 1977. It wasn't a state, but it probably would have led to one if they accepted it. Then they were again offered a state in 2000 at the Camp David summit Arafat turned it down. Then in 2006, Ehud Olmert had 30 negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas, who's a rabid anti-Semite and certainly has no interest in peace, but he offered him a Palestinian state, and Abbas said no. So Israel has negotiated, even though they know that the Palestinians want to destroy them, in the hope that maybe they won't. But the Palestinians always basically bail the Israelis out by saying no to every offer. And there's no reason to think that that's going to change anytime in the near future. Let me say something. Well, go ahead.
That has never happened with Hamas. So, how do you see the resolution of this Hamas conflict? Can Hamas really be destroyed? How do you see this being resolved in Gaza?
Hamas definitely can be destroyed. We're seeing it every day. They're killing, they've killed 9,000. I saw numbers of injured and arrested. That it's something like, they're saying supposedly Hamas has 30,000 members. Well, something like 40 to 50% have already been taken care of. And there's no reason to think Israel can't take care of the rest of them. Now, as many people have said, you can't kill an idea. And as I alluded to a few minutes ago, it's not about land. It's a lot about religion. And killing every Hamasnik isn't going to eliminate radical Islam from the planet or from Gaza or from the West Bank. And also, as people have said, and it's true, you have 1.5 million Palestinians who have been displaced from their homes. Many of their family members have been killed. Some of them are going to turn to terrorism. And so they're going to be, it may not be Hamas. Hamas might be gone, but they may be a group called Sons of Hamas that emerges. That's not a reason not to be destroying Hamas. I mean, we didn't say, the United States didn't say, okay, we're not going to destroy ISIS because if we do, other people will become terrorists as well. We said we have to destroy ISIS. We have to destroy Al-Qaeda. Israel has to destroy Hamas. And yeah, there will be people who turn to terrorism because of their anger over this. But, Israel can't make its policies or its strategy on the basis of what some might do as opposed to what they know others have done.
Thank you, Dr. Bard. One final question just to bring it home, and that is, what can we do? What can we do here? Whether, rabbis, Jewish communal leaders, or just, members of the Jewish community, what can we do to support Israel in this time? Where's the best use of our energy?
There are a number of things we can do. One is we have to participate in this election. I don't care who you vote for. I don't care what party you're in. You have to be involved in the election. Donate your time, your money, your energy, whatever you can do, and make your vote, because there are a lot of anti-Israel folks running for Congress. There are some that are already in the Congress, and that's a threat to Israel more than most things. So it's important to be involved politically. It's also important to protest against Qatar and what they've been doing, the fact that they are the hosts of Hamas, they're funders of Hamas. The United States now just signed a new deal to keep a military base there. We have a lot of leverage that we're not using against Qatar, but there are a lot of members of Congress now who are talking about it. We have to pay a lot more attention to what's going on college campuses. I don't think I have to tell all of you in New York what's going on in your campuses, but we need to speak out about it. You need to write to the presidents of the universities to tell them that what's going on is unacceptable. Universities are the only place in the United States where anti-Semitism is tolerated. It's simply got to stop. withhold donations. We're not all billionaires, so it may not faze them if you withhold your $25, but why should you give them money to continue the pattern of anti-Semitism on the campuses? And why should we send our kids to schools that have toxic environments? Yeah, I realize telling a parent, don't send your kid to Harvard because it's so anti-Semitic, it's Harvard. But do you really want to spend $70,000, $80,000 a year on tuition to send your kid to a place where they're going to be harassed because they're Jews or because they love Israel? And you have to pay attention to K through 12. All of this stuff that you're hearing about in college is filtering down into high schools and elementary schools. You need to pay attention to what's going on and make sure that the kinds of things that you're seeing on college campuses aren't happening in your school, because I could tell you they're happening in many. So that's another thing that we can do. We can support promoting Israel studies as a discipline, because most campuses don't even teach about Israel, and if they do, they teach in a negative way. So that's another thing that we can do. I think we shouldn't let ourselves feel helpless. We need to educate ourselves to know what the facts are, so that when we hear things in the media, we know, at least for ourselves, what is and isn't actually a fact, and that when we speak to others, that we can explain to them why Israel's doing what it's doing, what Israel's gone through, and why it's necessary for the United States to continue to support Israel. You need to talk to your non-Jewish neighbors, your coworkers, try to create dialogue with other groups to the extent we can. Unfortunately, so many of the social justice and liberal groups that Jews have been a part of over the decades have turned out to be the greatest supporters of terrorism and Hamas. So it's very difficult, but we need allies. We're still a tiny population in the United States, and we can't survive on our own, certainly politically. So we need to continue to try to find allies wherever we can, and not back down to the bullies. One of the things that drives me crazy is that not enough Jews are standing up for Israel, especially on college campuses. I know it's tough to be a student outnumbered by the anti-Israel people. I was one of them when I was at UCLA and when I was at Berkeley. But, there are schools like UCLA that have 4,000 Jewish students. Where are they? Why are they cowering in their dorm rooms or hiding in Hillels? They need to be fortified. We need to make them feel like they can stand up for themselves. Doesn't mean they have to go out screaming and debating with, anti-Semites or anti-Israel people, but they need to be able to say, I'm a proud Jew. I'm not going to be afraid to wear my yarmulke or my Magen David on the college campus. This is America. So it's, it's up to the parents to some degree to make sure that our kids are getting the right education about Israel, and that they have the confidence and the self-esteem to be able to go out in the world as a proud Jew and as a lover of Israel. And if they can, send them to Israel. We all should go to Israel when we have the opportunity, when the conditions allow, because that's the best way to be educated and to understand what Israelis are going through.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bard, for this talk. It was really necessary and needed, and learned so much from your views and your knowledge. And just want to say that we're always praying for the success of the Israeli soldiers, and that the hostages are freed, but that the soldiers come back soon, complete their mission successfully. And that includes your son. We pray that all the IDF come back swiftly to their loved ones, and we resolve this soon. All right. Thank you, Dr. Bard.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Everyone have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.